Thank you, President. As a regional MP from a farming background, I've found this bill difficult, possibly one of the most personally difficult ones I've dealt with in the last 2 years. I've listened to the landholders who've contacted me with a great deal of sympathy. I absolutely understand their concerns and I share some of them. However, as a party, the Liberal Democrats' position is clear. Public access to public lands is something I've repeated many times in this place. While saying it, I've been thinking about the government's ongoing lockouts from our national parks, an attack on the rights of Victorians, but it also applies equally to these waterfronts. Of course, this legislation is partly to ameliorate the effects of these lockouts. You've had to find other land to partly make up for the Crown land you've locked us out of. But be that as it may, the government has found a way to continue to buy green votes in the city while still retaining some support from people who actually go out into the bush camping. This bill will impact farmers. There will inevitably be trespass. There will, from time to time, be animals attacked. Bushfires may break out. These risks cannot be denied. However, this bill also represents an opportunity for the users of this Crown land to work together to manage it. While the government will introduce regulations, they will inevitably lack the ability to enforce them. However, my great hope is that we'll evolve a self-regulating culture amongst campers to ensure that these issues are managed. As a libertarian, I believe civil society has far more value than an overbearing government dictating behaviour. In my maiden speech, I talked about a fishing club I'm a member of that has been camping on the same site for 50 years. We maintain that campsite, remove our rubbish and indeed feel a sense of responsibility for the land there. That is what I hope we will see repeated again and again. Members of the public building bonds with this land over time and indeed with the leaseholders as well, and managing the land appropriately. There has always been a right of access to this land. Some leaseholders may not have realised these access rights existed, but they have. Parliament first started talking about this in the 1850s. In the early days of Victorian settlement, there was a serious problem with the squatters establishing monopolies over water in the inland and using that control over the water to ensure that they were the only ones able to make productive use of the land. Actually, this has echoes of what is going on today with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, but I digress. Parliament had its first serious crack at addressing the issues in 1860. The Land Bill of 1860 sought to prevent the alienation of any Crown River frontages. The Attorney-General then said, "We merely indicate the general policy of the government by the term water frontages. From the 15th to the 20th clause, the House will find the provisions are chiefly framed for starting this system which, when the lands are once thrown open to the public, will, I think, be such as will prevent any monopoly by one section of the people to prejudice of another. Exceptions often cause more difficulties than general rules, and these clauses are a proof of it. In order to prevent the first person who rushes on the land from monopolising the best portions of it, we ensure that the race shall not always be to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. For these reasons, we have found it necessary to adopt the machinery which has been provided in these clauses." Ultimately, that Act was amended to remove these provisions that prevented alienation, since it was feared that Victoria would not be able to have mills if they couldn't be built on rivers and ownership retained on those frontages. There may have been merit to that view, but the decision would have had lasting implications, as many land bills have come before Parliament over the years that followed. The squattocracy fought a political rearguard action throughout the 1860s and 1870s to try to consolidate their water access as a means of depressing land values to selectors. This issue was not fully resolved until, as far as I can tell, 6 land bills later in 1915, when remaining Crown River land frontages were reserved for public use. As far as I can tell, there was no ban on camping at this point. In fact, it seems to be impossible to nail down when the camping was banned, or why. It seems to have been instituted when the Land Act 1958 was brought onto the books. But the Land Act 1958 was never debated in Parliament because it was a product of a consolidation bill. For all the world, it looks as though it was snuck in. The consolidation bills of this period were monstrous documents. Indeed, in 1958 Hansard, the Attorney-General seriously talks at length about consolidation bills overwhelming the printing capacity of Melbourne. Like some of the omnibus bills we've seen in the last 10 years, they were often too big to be properly reviewed. At the time, the Minister for Lands and Soldier Settlement was under pressure from the then Country Party, who had blindsided the Liberals by abandoning their coalition to form minority government with Labor support in 1950. It seems very plausible to me that concessions like a ban on camping on Crown land, at least for grazing, might have been snuck in during the consolidation to try to shore up support. In any case, it was never debated, at least not anywhere my staff could find it in this parliament. I raise all that in an extremely roundabout way to get to the point. If the shoe was on the other foot and camping on Crown River frontages were allowed right now, and we were debating whether or not we should ban it, there is no way the Liberal Democrats would ever vote for that. 80% of water frontages in Victoria are under private ownership, and this bill does not affect them. It affects only the river frontages that are not owned by farmers who abut it. So why is this relevant? Well, try to make the case the other way, the one that was never made in 1958. Make the case that was never made about why the public shouldn't have access to this public land because the private landholder next to it doesn't want them to use it that way. It's just not tenable. And that is what this comes down to. Those who object to allowing camping on these river frontages do it because they have an implicit belief that abutting it or leasing it for grazing gives them a greater right over this land than they actually have. This is public land, and the public should have access. Think back to 1860. This is not a new issue. The idea of some farmers claiming a monopoly over the use of river frontages to the exclusion of others has been central to the argument over the management of the land we're talking about for hundreds of years. I am sympathetic to the concerns farmers have. This change will very likely become a headache for farmers and the government and DELP if enforcement is perceived as lax. There's no question that some people are irresponsible idiots and that some of them go camping. On the other hand, the fact that some people do the wrong thing is never valid grounds to ban everyone who does the right thing from doing something. I understand they plan to limit the issues that they might face from this legislation by using regulation to continue to prohibit camping in many river locations, but we don't really know what will be in the regulations. At the end of the day, despite my personal feelings, this is a pretty simple issue. If it's public land, then it must be available for public use. Parliament has been trying to work out a way to allow the use of these commons by the public for nearly 150 years now, and it seems like we're going to take another step on that journey today.